Time for business. I'm pleased to announce Kate Moody joins us. Good evening, Kate.
Hi, Mark.
Starting with the closing bell on Wall Street.
Absolutely. For the second day in a row, Mark, Amazon is the most valuable public company in the world, having passed Microsoft on Monday. Amazon shares up a further 1.7% at the close on Monday. U.S. stocks broadly ended higher as investors remain largely optimistic about ongoing trade talks between the U.S. and China. The Dow Jones climbed 200 points for its first three-day winning streak since November. Earlier on, the major European indices closed higher as well. In Paris, shares of Renault rose 3% as the carmaker's boss, Carlos Ghosn, appeared in court in Japan. The World Bank has warned that trade tensions are weighing on economic expansion around the world. In its newly released annual forecast, the organization downgraded its expectations for global growth from 3% in 2018 to 2.9% and 2.8% this year and next. Advanced economies are particularly suffering from the trade war, which has engulfed the U.S. and China. Emerging and developing economies are predicted to be more insulated for now, but they will feel increasing effects if those tensions drag on. Earlier, I spoke to the lead author of the report about what risks are most prevalent.
We see global growth slowing, and the darkening skies that are in the title of our report, they do refer to the growing downside risks to global growth. And perhaps one of the two most urgent risks is exactly these rising trade tensions, or the possibility that they escalate further. Now, if you look back to 2018, for now, the tariffs that were implemented in 2018 account for only 2.5% of global goods trade. Even if everything that was discussed was implemented, this would only account for 5% of global goods trade. So this number per se does not appear like much. Our concern, from the view of emerging markets and developing economies, is that it's the two largest economies in the world that are having these tensions. Together, the US and China account for 20% of global trade, 40% of global output. If trade tensions derail or even just slow growth in these two large economies, that is something that will reverberate around the world economy, and it will slow growth in emerging markets and developing economies.
Tell me a little bit more about that. More concretely speaking, how are these emerging economies really being impacted by what is, as you said, largely a trade dispute among advanced economies?
For now, it is part of a more challenging external environment for emerging markets and developing economies. Global trade has slowed already. Global export PMIs are already in contractionary territory. The whole global manufacturing cycle has turned, and that is something that is very strongly correlated with trade. So already emerging markets and developing economies face much more difficult trade conditions, or much weaker external demand. That comes on top of much tighter financing conditions, much higher borrowing costs and capital outflows from emerging markets and developing economies. So altogether, this is a package of a much more challenging external environment for emerging markets and developing economies.
Your report also focuses on the problem of debt. More and more countries, like Italy, certainly, which we've focused on a lot here in the EU, but also in other parts of the world, are suffering under a higher debt-to-GDP ratio. What's the best way for them to reduce that burden? Yes,
debt has risen across the world. And I can tell you, in 3/4 of emerging markets and developing economies, government debt is now 10 percentage points of GDP higher than it was 10 years ago. So in a broad-based deterioration, most countries are more vulnerable to rising borrowing costs. What can be done? What can be done has really three components that apply in particular to emerging markets and developing economies, and the less developed, the more they apply. First is debt management, transparent debt recording, just general debt transparency, strong debt management to make sure that the composition of debt is such that it's not vulnerable to market disruptions. Second, whatever is borrowed is actually well spent. So the second angle for any government rising debt will be to improve expenditure management. That could be things like procurement. That could be things like monitoring the actual implementation of the projects that are financed by the debt. And the third angle is, of course, domestic resource mobilization. That is something that applies especially to the least developed countries. For example, in low-income countries, the debt-to-GDP ratio is 19% of GDP. That compares with with middle-income or upper-middle-income countries of 28% of GDP revenue ratios. So domestic resource mobilization is a very important part of containing the vulnerabilities from rising debt, especially in the least developed economies.
More broadly speaking, how worried or perhaps confident should we be in the state of the global economy as we head into 2019?
Well, if things materialize as we expect in the baseline scenario, and the most likely scenario, this is not a bad scenario. This is a gradual slowdown towards long-term sustainable growth rates. The problem is, our real concern is about the risks around this baseline scenario. They really are rising, and they're substantially tilted, firmly tilted to the downside.
Some warning words there from the World Bank, Mark.
Kate, thank you very much indeed. Kate there with all the business.